In this lecture, we are going to answer the question, what is privacy? If you are new to privacy or to my courses, then this is going to be a great introduction to the topic of privacy for you. A quick note that if you've taken any of my other privacy courses, that this introductory section is identical to those. So of course, you're welcome to continue, but if you'd like to skip on and go directly to domain 1, that's okay too. Otherwise, for the rest of you, in this lecture, we are going to define what privacy is. We are going to look at subsets of PII, or personally identifiable information. And then we are going to look at the importance of context when considering PII. Specifically, we're going to be looking at what happens when we combine different data elements, or when we're looking at data elements that originate from a specific location. With regards to defining privacy, the seminal work that really ushered in our current understanding of privacy today is The Right to Privacy by Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis. Their article, titled The Right to Privacy, was published in the Harvard Law Review in 1890. And I have the first page of that article on the right-hand side here. As much as I would love to read the opening paragraph for you, I will not. However, I strongly encourage you, if you have the time, to hit pause and read that. You will notice that 130 plus years later, this opening passage really resonates with our contemporary experience. The main takeaway for Warren and Brandeis is that privacy was the right to be let alone. And so when you see that phrase out and about in the wild, just know that that's where that phrase, the right to be let alone, originates. For a more contemporary take on what privacy is, and more importantly, why privacy matters, I recommend Neil Richards' Why Privacy Matters, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2021. And while we won't go into why privacy matters here, the important takeaway is Richards' definition of privacy. And Richards defines privacy as the degree to which human information is neither known nor used. Another way of thinking about privacy is by bucketing it into different domains. And 4 different categories of privacy that we can start thinking about as we're getting started conceptually here are information, bodily, territorial, and communication. With regards to information privacy, in the U.S. legal context, for example, U.S. law looks at privacy in different domains. The way that you deal with personally identifiable information in an education context is going to be different than in a medical or financial context. Bodily privacy concerns our right as human beings to be able to make decisions that concern our own bodies. Reproductive health care and gender-affirming care, for example, fall within bodily privacy. There is territorial privacy, which I think is something that everyone's going to have some familiarity with. Your property, your home, your bedroom, for example. And finally, communication privacy. And this concerns the exchange of information, whether you're exchanging that information orally in conversation with a friend, electronically via email, or via paper, perhaps through a snail mail letter that you're sending to a pen pal. And just to be clear, I've just used the term personally identifiable information, or PII. This is anything that is linked or linkable to an individual. Your name, for example, this is probably the most PII of all PII. Your name directly identifies you. 4 subsets of PII that we will talk about again throughout the course include sensitive personal information, pseudonymized data, de-identified data, and anonymized data. Sensitive data is considered sensitive because the impact of losing that data is higher. For example, if a malicious actor hacks into a computer system, they steal a bunch of data and then leak that data onto the internet, what type of damage could be done with that data? Well, if the data is simply a list of names with no other context, then there's really not a lot of damage that could be done. Similarly, with your social security number, with your financial data, with your medical data, that data is sensitive because the use of that data in different contexts could do a high degree of harm to individuals. Pseudonymized data, this is data where identifiers such as name have been replaced. For example, replacing Kyle David with John Doe. De-identified data is where identifiers have been removed. And so, for example, if there's a dataset that contains my name, removing my name de-identifies the dataset. And finally, anonymized data is where re-identification is impossible. And so in this case, it's not just obvious or direct identifiers, such as name and address, that have been removed, but the data has been altered to an extent that the application of advanced statistical techniques or data aggregation would still make it impossible to re-identify the individual to whom the data belongs. Two more subsets of data that you need to know for the exam come specifically from the GDPR, or the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. But two subsets of data that belong to the GDPR are personal data and sensitive personal data. Personal data relates to an identified or identifiable person. Under the GDPR, for example, cookies and IP addresses are considered personal data. Sensitive personal data includes the following data elements: information about an individual's race or ethnicity, political opinions, religious and philosophical beliefs, union membership, genetic and biometric data, health data, and sexuality. So it's important you understand, within the context of the GDPR, the difference between personal data and sensitive personal data. On the topic of context and combination, there are two landmark studies that demonstrate how combining low-risk data increases the ability of researchers or malicious actors to re-identify de-identified data. From very early in the 21st century, an article titled "Simple Demographics Often Identify People Uniquely," a researcher was able to identify 87% of Americans using just those individuals' zip code, gender, and date of birth. So again, when you think about it, a zip code on its own is not going to identify an individual. Gender on its own is not going to identify an individual. Date of birth on its own, again, is not going to identify an individual. But when you take those three data elements and you combine them, then 87% of the time, again, this was about 20 years ago, researchers are able to identify the specific individual. What about with just one data element, something like geolocation data? Similarly, an article titled "The Privacy Bounds of Human Mobility," using just 4 geolocation data points, was able to identify 95% of individuals. And so you might be asking, well, is it only when you combine sensitive data that you're able to re-identify individuals? And my answer is no, because again, context is important. Think about a small office where maybe there are just 4 or 5 people, or maybe a dozen or so. Let's imagine that you're sitting in the cafeteria, you're enjoying lunch, and one of your colleagues comes up to you and says, "Hey, I've got some gossip. Someone in the office said that you have the absolute worst coffee breath." Well, this person, they're clearly looking to stir up some trouble here. And so you prod and you ask, well, who was it that said that? And your colleague says, "Oh, I've already said too much. I'm not going to tell you their name, but I'll let you know that it's the tallest person in the office." Well, height on its own is not going to identify an individual. But if you have a small office and you know who the tallest person is, then that data point has identified the individual. You can do the same thing with age and with gender. The final point on context and location. One thing that we're going to see throughout the course is that data receives different protections depending on its context and location. So whether or not a piece of data has legal protections is going to be contingent on many factors. For example, let's say you have some medical information, and that medical information is in a medical record that's held by your doctor. Well, most doctors, because they receive reimbursements from the US federal government, that doctor is going to be considered a covered entity, and your medical information is going to be considered protected health information, or PHI. Therefore, that medical information is protected under HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. So again, your health information with a covered entity, it is protected under HIPAA. Now I want you to imagine that same health information, perhaps it's in your browser history. You were doing some research on a medical condition, or let's imagine that you have that same health information in an app on your smartphone. Well, your web browser, the internet, those are not covered entities. Similarly, a smartphone app is unlikely to be considered a covered entity. And so in these two locations, that same medical information is not protected. And so again, this is just one more example of how context and location is important when considering the protections afforded to certain types of personally identifiable information. In this lecture, we have answered the question, what is privacy? Two definitions that we looked at include the right to be left alone and the degree to which information is neither known nor used. Subsets of PII include information, bodily, territorial, and communication, sensitive, pseudonymized, de-identified, and anonymized. And under the GDPR, you need to remember personal data and sensitive personal data. Finally, context is important. Data in aggregate increases the data's sensitivity, and location, such as with a covered entity or in your web browser, often determines the protections afforded to that personal data.